A very warm welcome to all of you. In today's lecture, we will begin with migration theory. So, we go back to where it all began. We will cover two seminal theorists, Ernst George Ravenstein, who formulated the very first laws of migration published in 1885 and 1889, and then move on to Everett Lee's 1966 paper on the theory of migration, which builds on Ravenstein's work. So, these laws and theories of migration are the theoretical and conceptual building blocks of migration theory. They continue to be the foundation of all theoretical developments that have happened since in migration studies. Both theoretical and empirical researchers continue to refer to Ravenstein's laws of migration, and Lee's work is understood to be the foundation of the very popular push and pull framework in migration. So, let me first take you through Ravenstein's work. So, in 1885, Ernst George Ravenstein published a paper titled The Laws of Migration. Now, his main motivation to do this paper was that migration appeared to go on without any definite law, which directed his attention to this subject. In his 1885 paper, he used data of the place of birth from the 1871 and 1881 census data from the United Kingdom to theorize or to come up with his laws. Then in 1889, he wrote another paper responding to the feedback he received on the 1885 paper. So, what he does in the 1889 paper is that he extends his analysis to Europe and North America to data from more than 20 countries. So, Ravenstein, as you might know, was a geographer. He used data from the census of Great Britain to theorize the movement of migrants. And his work was at the intersection of demography, or population studies, and geography. So, what I want to do in this lecture is to take you through the laws of migration based on both of these seminal papers. Right. So, Ravenstein begins his 1889 paper by stating that he is of course aware that the laws of population and economic laws do not have the rigidity of physical laws, as they are continually being interfered by human agency. So, it is really fascinating that he uses the term human agency in 1889 in the context that agency has become such a fundamental concept in contemporary social sciences now, where agency is conceptualized at one end of the spectrum, whereas the other end of the spectrum is structure. So, we will cover agency and structure in a separate lecture in depth. So, however, for now what we see is that Ravenstein is arguing that the currents of migration, he calls them the currents of migration, that they are natural and there is something elemental about these currents of migration. Yet, the currents of migration which flow naturally in certain directions can be stopped legally through legislative enactments, but they still produce the currents which are very elemental. So, then he takes us to the fundamental question, why is it that migration happens? Why does migration take place? Now, Ravenstein addresses this fundamental question attributing economic reasons to migration. In the 1885 paper, he states that there is no doubt that the call for labor in centers of industry and commerce is the prime cause of the currents of migration. He finds that the currents of migration were towards the manufacturing districts of Lancashire and Yorkshire from London, thus reflecting that the movement of migrants were governed by business considerations. In his 1889 paper, he also states that the desire inherent in most men is to better themselves in material respects, as he explains migration. And it's really fascinating, and I quote, he states, "Bad or oppressive laws, heavy taxation, and an unattractive climate, uncongenial social surroundings, and even compulsion such as slave trade, transportation have all produced and are still producing currents of migration, but none of these currents can compare in volume with that which arises from the desire inherent in most of men to better themselves in material respects." So, you can see, you can see how very fundamental, very critical to Ravenstein's laws is the reason, is the aspect of agency, how a man's and also a woman's agency is a fundamental role in their migration movements. So going forward, there are certain laws of this migration, and I'm going to highlight the 7 laws that have been constructed by Ravenstein. So the very first law is that the majority of migrants only move a short distance. So now the first one he says is that most migration is short distance. Most migrants move only a short distance. Under normal conditions, the migratory movement will be a slow one, it will be a gradual one, it will proceed step by step, and it will take place province by province. It's very interesting that Ravenstein compares this migration of the movement which is produced to a cistern of water after a tap has been turned on. So in other words, the first law is that migrants mainly move over short distances. However, while most migration is short distance, we will see later in the 5th law of migration that those going longer distances head for the great centers of industry and commerce. What about the second law? The second law is as such. The second law says that the absorption processes are mostly from the inhabitants immediately surrounding a rapidly growing town, often in a step-by-step process. Gaps left in rural populations are filled by migrants from more remote districts. So now the second law is the law of absorption, really, and he argues that absorption will grow less as the distance from the center increases. And so therefore, what Ravenstein is also arguing is that the inhabitants of the countryside or the rural areas surrounding a town, a city, they rapidly flock it as a city or a town grows. In other words, the gaps left in the rural population or in rural areas from where population exodus has happened are filled by migrants from more remote districts. Therefore, bit by bit, migrants are absorbed in the town, in the neighboring areas, and even in the remote areas, till there is a force of that rapidly growing city that is felt. Now, coming to the third law is quite simple. The third law states that just like absorption, you have dispersion processes, and dispersion processes are the inverse of absorption ones, and they exhibit similar features. Now, let us come to the fourth law. The fourth law is quite interesting. The fourth law is that each main current of migration produces a compensating countercurrent. So this is something which, we will also see this as we go along in Everett Lee's work and even more fundamental empirical work later. And the fourth law has to do with the currents of migration. So every current that is there of migration, every movement that you have provides a counter current. Now this is something that Ravenstein formulated in his first 1885 paper, that with each mainstream or current of migration, there runs a counter current which more or less compensates for the losses sustained by outmigration or emigration. Now, this counter current can be strong in some cases, weak in others, but it's universal. He argues that it exists everywhere. And in the 1885 paper, he uses the example of London to show that for every 100 in-migrants or immigrants in London, which he calls the current, 50 natives leave the metropolis, which is the countercurrent. The countercurrent, he argues, is feebler or is less strong than the main current. We now come to the fifth law of migration. According to Ravenstein, the fifth law is that migrants proceeding long distances generally go by preference to one of the great centers of commerce or industry. So therefore, what you have is that there takes place consequently a universal shifting or displacement of the population, which Ravenstein says produces currents of migration setting in the direction of towns and cities, great centers of commerce and industry, which in turn absorb the migrants. So what we also see then is that considerable migration is from agricultural to industrial areas. We come to the sixth law. The sixth law says that the natives of towns are less migratory than those of the rural parts of the country. Now, this seems logical Rural populations have a higher propensity to migrate compared to urban populations. So, there is also an understanding, there is also a perception, and of course, empirically valid that much migration is from rural to urban areas. The seventh law, which is also quite a controversial law, which Ravenstein has gone on to defend quite a bit, is about gender differences in migration. So, the law goes like this, that females are more migratory than males, and this last law is related to the male-female differentials in migration that I just pointed out, that females appear to be more prominent, females appear to predominate short journey migrations. Males, on the other hand, are more likely to migrate long distances. Now, while there has been criticism over this law, like I said, Ravenstein has asserted that this census figures show exactly this, greater female mobility. So, these were the 7 basic laws of migration that Ravenstein developed that continue to be the foundation of migration theory. And then he also speaks about technology and development. So, through the census data, he also found that an increase in transport, communication, locomotion, manufacture and commerce led to an increase in immigration. So, if you seek out places or provinces which are either great centers of human industry or part of a country where resources have only just become available, you will find that migration to these places is increasing. Therefore, hinting that migration increases with technology, with development. Ravenstein also developed something that he called the laws of migration and the town. This law has to do with the question whether the growth of large towns is at the expense of the rural, that is, depopulation of rural areas. Now, to this question he answers yes, and he says, if left to their own resources and dependent upon the national increment or population growth, towns would have grown very slowly. So, it is really in migration, it is rural-urban migration that explains the growth of towns and cities. Now, as in the slide, you can see that the percentage of population who are the native population, that is population born in these cities, the principal towns of Europe, is very low. So, the table gives you the percentage of natives in principal towns of Europe, and you can see that in the late 19th century, a significant proportion of the population born was not native. You can see that in the table, only 63% of London's population was native. For Rome, this number was even lower at 44.6%. And for Paris, for Vienna, it was even lower at 34.9 and 34.5% respectively. So, in his 1889 paper, Ravenstein really shows how migration plays out in these cities and how a significant proportion of the population of these cities were migrants to the cities in Europe. So, the historical experience then of Western countries has been one where development, which is industrialization, urbanization, have been due to large scale rural urban migration. In fact, the transfer of population from agriculture to industry, from the rural areas to the urban areas, from the village to the city is a fundamental part of modernization theories. So, it is very interesting and somewhat even paradoxical that Ravenstein takes the view that this rural exodus, which he points to in his 1889 paper, and you can clearly see it in the table on the screen, is that this rural exodus that went on in nearly all parts of Europe, he terms it as deplorable. So, the data clearly shows and his law clearly states that the rural exodus of current migrants from rural to urban areas is a fact. But his own view on the matter is that this is something terrible that had to happen. There are also several analytical concepts that are important in Ravenstein's work. Remember, he worked with census data, he was interested in migration. So what he did was he divided all the population into what he calls 4 elements, which are determined by the place of birth. So the place of birth is a very important concept here, and he divides the population into 4 elements by the place of birth. So now very simply, the first element is the parochial element. So the parish is the lowest level of local government, and the parochial element is that population or those inhabitants who resided in the parish or the local county or the town in which they were born at the time of the census. We next come to the provincial element. Provincial element refers to persons enumerated in the province in which they were born. And then national element refers to all persons born in the country, and foreign element refers to persons born abroad. So this is an interesting classification of the population determined by the place of birth. He also classifies migrants as local migrants, short journey migrants, long journey migrants, temporary migrants, as well as foreign migrants. And you can see that these are very interesting, useful, analytical categories that we'll see in the course of this course, that they've been used across in conceptual work, in empirical work, and so on. So the paper ends quite dramatically with Ravenstein stating that migration means life and progress, a sedentary population, stagnation. So it's very interesting, you know, though he frames migration like that, he frames migration as a fundamental part of development, and migration seems to be the most natural order of things. He also seems to contradict it with his previous point about how he finds rural exodus deplorable, the movement of people from rural to urban areas deplorable and terrible. I also want to bring to your notice that there have been some critiques of Ravenstein's work. After reading Ravenstein's paper in the discussion, N.A. Humphreys came to the conclusion that migration was distinguished for its lawlessness rather than for having any definite law. Empirically too, there are a lot of theories, don't seem to hold solid ground. But however, fundamentally, Ravenstein's work is seminal. It really is the starting point for work in migration theory. He theorized from the data. His concepts of the currents of migration is truly extraordinary. And he argued, in his paper, there are these currents, there's a sense. He argues that migration is a fundamental, inseparable part of development. And of course, where the causes of migration are mainly economic. If you search for it, you can find the push-pull framework in Ravenstein's laws. You can see that he is developmentally oriented, leaning more towards the pull of the city than any kind of push from the village or any source region. With that, we close on Ravenstein's laws of migration and move to Everett S. Lee's 1966 paper titled The Theory of Migration, that was published in the journal Demography. So after Ravenstein's 1885-89 papers on the laws of migration, this is a seminal paper, this is an ambitious paper that develops a theory of migration. So you see, from early on, theorizing in migration, building theories was not commonplace. It took more than 75 years from Ravenstein's laws of migration to Lee's theories of migration, both of which are milestones in the migration literature, yet have been critiqued considerably. Now, you may be familiar with the push and pull framework in migration or push and pull factors of migration. Very interestingly, the push-pull theory is attributed to this paper of Lee. Even though he does not use the word push or pull or like push and pull factors or push and pull framework in his paper, somehow the theory of push and pull theory, if we can call it a theory, is attributed to this paper. So now coming to Everett Lee's theory of migration, he offers a hypothesis about the volume of migration and the characteristics of migrants. In this lecture, I will cover the paper only in part, highlighting, emphasizing the origins of the famous push and pull framework, and then we will take on some characteristics of migrants. I strongly encourage all of you to read the original 1966 paper, which is simply written, and it really provides much of a theoretical foundation to migration studies as we understand it now. Now, having said that, Lee begins the paper starting with Ravenstein's law of migration and how, despite their critique, some of which we discussed earlier, Lee asserts in 1966 that these papers have stood the test of time and they remain the starting point of work in migration theory. Now, Lee starts his paper by attempting to define migration with a definition of migration. So, what is Everett Lee's definition of migration? Everett Lee says, he states that migration is defined broadly as the permanent or semi-permanent change of residence. No restriction is placed upon the distance of the move, upon the voluntary or involuntary nature of the act, and no distinction is made between external and internal migration. So, therefore, he goes on to say that a move across the hall from one apartment to another is counted just as much as an act of migration as a move from Bombay, India to Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Though, of course, the initiation and consequences of such moves are vastly very different. All kinds of spatial mobility are included in this definition. For him, for Lee, excluded other continual movements of nomads, migratory workers for whom there is no long-term residence, and temporary moves like those who move for the holidays to the mountains in the summer and so on. So, now according to Lee, no matter how short or how long, how easy or how difficult, every act of migration involves first an origin, second a destination, and third an intervening set of obstacles. Now, among the set of obstacles, we include distance of the move as one that is always present. So, for Lee, distance is a fundamental intervening obstacle, one of the most important intervening obstacles in the act of migration. So, you can see in the graph that there are factors in the act of migration, factors associated with the area of origin, factors associated with the area of destination, and intervening obstacles. What do we mean by intervening obstacles? Lee argues that between every 2 points, there stand a set of intervening obstacles. They may be slight or minor in some instances. In other instances, they might be insurmountable, very hard to cross. And different people are affected in different ways by the same set of obstacles. What might be trivial to some people, for example, the cost of transportation, may be prohibitive to others. So now, as I mentioned earlier, the most important intervening obstacle according to Everett Lee is distance. The farther the place, the less likely one may be to move. Similarly, intervening obstacles can be physical barriers like the Berlin Wall that used to divide East and West Germany. Lee argues, in today's day and age, an example of such a physical barrier would be the US-Mexico border wall being constructed by the US government to halt or reduce migration. This would be a pertinent example of a physical barrier or an intervening obstacle as conceptualized by Everett Lee. Similarly, other intervening obstacles could be immigration laws and so on. Lee then refers to personal factors and he also calls them life cycle. What do we mean by personal factors? What do we mean by life cycle? So, we know that younger people are more likely to migrate than older people because they're more mobile, life is less restrictive for younger people. Similarly, all things equal, Lee argues that a married person with family and children is less likely to migrate than an unemployed person. However, a family man with no source of employment may be compelled to migrate. So, the context matters. The context to personal factors, the context to life cycle also matters. The other thing Lee does is that he argues that migration tends to take place within well-defined streams, from specific places at origin to specific places at the destination. Not only because the opportunities tend to be highly localized, but also because the flow of knowledge back from destination facilitates the passage for later migrants. So now in the diagram that you see, which is taken from Lee's original article published in 1966, it shows that the plus that you see are the positive attributes. The positive attributes tend to hold people back at origin or attract them to destination. Similarly, the minus that you see are the negative attributes. Negative attributes, according to Lee, tend to push people out of source areas or to repel them from migrating to destination areas. And the O's that you see indicate attributes people are indifferent towards in both source and destination areas. Now, it's very important to note here that Lee says that it is not so much the actual factors at origin and destination as the perception of these factors which results in migration. So, therefore, according to Lee, personal sensitivities, intelligence, awareness of conditions elsewhere, all of these enter into the evaluation of the situation of the origin and the knowledge of the situation at destination. Depends on personal contacts or upon sources of information which are not universally available. In addition, he argues that there are personalities which are resistant to change. So, personal factors also matter by way of personalities. Some people are resistant to change of residence, and there are other personalities which welcome change for the sake of change. So, for some individuals, there must be compelling reasons to migrate, whereas for others, there is very little provocation or promise that suffices. So, therefore, then, the decision to migrate is never completely rational, and not everyone who migrates reaches that decision themselves. Now, this is a really interesting point. You know, we spoke about migrant agency earlier. Both Ravenstein and Lee emphasize in their own, in their own work, overtly and covertly, to migration agency. But not everyone who migrates reaches that decision themselves. And so Lee uses the example of children who are carried along with their parents, whether they like it or not. He also uses the examples of wives who accompany their husbands, and he argues, he writes that it tears them away from the environments they love. Wives moving with husbands tears them away from the environments they love. So you see, gender is also important, and it comes up in Lee's paper. And women are predominantly characterized as not migrants in their own right, but as associational migrants, those who accompany men, and they are compelled to accompany men, often against their wishes. Now, this is something that we will talk about more in our lectures on gender and migration. But for now, to say that, okay, there are people who don't make migration decisions on their own, but others make their decisions on their behalf, and in Lee's paper, wives and children are two such categories of people. Now, let us come to the characteristics of migrants. So, the first characteristic is that migration is selective. Now, this is a very powerful statement, and what this means is that migrants are not a random sample of the population. Migration is selective. Not everybody migrates, and migrants cannot and are not randomly selected, right? The reason why migration is selective, Lee argues, is that persons respond differently to the sets of pluses and minuses that we saw in the origin and at destination, right? They have different abilities to overcome the intervening set of obstacles, and they differ from each other in terms of personal factors discussed. Now, it would seem impossible, therefore, for migration not to be selective. However, the kind of selection varies In some streams, the selection is positive, which means that migrants are of high quality, that it could be that migrants are positively selected by education, by income, by wealth, by occupation. And in other streams, you find that migration is negatively selected. Negative selection means just the opposite of positive selection. It means that migrants are negatively selected for income, for wealth, for education, and so on. And this is also in certain contexts known as adverse incorporation. You could have distress oriented streams where migrants are pushed out. So therefore, fundamentally, one of the key characteristics of migrants is that migration itself is selective. The second characteristic that Lee discusses is that these persons are under no necessity to migrate, but do so because they perceive opportunities from afar and they can weigh advantages, disadvantages, origin and destination. So, what he is really saying is that migrants respond primarily to plus factors at destination, tend to be positively selected. So, those migrants who respond to plus factors at destination tend to be positively selected. And one example would be highly educated people, right? Highly educated people who are already fairly comfortable, but they might decide to move because they get a better offer elsewhere. So, the professional class, the managerial class, these classes are highly mobile, these people are highly mobile, and that's very often because migration for them means advancement. And in contemporary times, a lot of skilled migration from developing countries to developed countries falls in this category. So, in sum, what he is saying is that taking it all together, migrant selection tends to be bimodal. What does that mean? This means for any given origin, some migrants are leaving due to the plus factors at destination, and therefore they tend to be positively selected, whereas others are responding to minus factors and therefore they tend to be negatively selected. So, therefore, if you plot the characteristics of all the migrants, the continuum ranges from poor to excellent. Another key characteristics of migrants according to Lee is that there is a heightened propensity to migrate at a certain stage in the life cycle, and this plays a role in migrant selectivity. Now, we discussed earlier personal factors and life cycle. So, here what Lee is very simply saying is that it is to some degree that migration is actually a rite of passage. Persons who enter the labor force or who get married tend to migrate from their parental home. So, life cycle really matters a lot. Young people tend to be more migratory as we discussed earlier, but with caveats. Marital status matters, the size of the family matters, and eventually the pluses and minuses in both source and destination matter. Now, we come to a bit of a critique of this push and pull framework, and the main reading for this is De Haas's 2008 working paper, which we are going to use across the course. It's a very, very well written, very thorough working paper on the theories of migration. So, what De Haas says is that there are many ways in which the push and pull literature has been amply criticized. Just like Ravenstein's laws were termed as lawless earlier, critics have argued that this framework, the push and pull framework, can it be called a theory at all? And so he says that, so one criticism is that the push-pull framework is rather descriptive, and all you have is factors playing a role in migration decisions, and they are just enumerated arbitrarily, and the framework is quite descriptive. The other issue with the framework is that you have very diffuse scales of analysis. So, I want to refresh your memory on our discussion on the units of analysis. So, what exactly is the unit of analysis here, from the individual to the global? So, Lee doesn't really outline these various units of analysis whether they are macro, whether they are micro, whether they are individual, whether it's the household, whether it's the community or the nation state. So, since he doesn't do that, the question is, what are the relative weights for different factors in that need to be given? That is not clear. And of course, the other fundamental issue is that it's not possible to have empirical testing for the role of factors, because very many important factors are not included in the push-pull framework or the push-pull theory. So, the other fundamental issue is that the push and pull are basically mirrored in one another, right? For instance, Dehas argues that a push, if you want to understand a push, you can understand that as rural population growth, which is caused, there's population pressure, there's rural population growth, and there's pressure on agricultural resources that is pushing people out of marginal rural areas. So, that's the push. And the pull is, economic condition at cities, higher wages, luring people to cities and industrialized countries. Now, the question really is then, what is the dominant factor? The fundamental question is, which is the dominant factor? High wage in destination or low wage in the source region of migration? Which is the dominant factor? And then that brings, that sort of brings it to its logical conclusion. Do we really need two factors, high wage at destination and low wage in source? Isn't one variable, let's say that a wage differential, isn't that simply enough? The other set of critiques for the push and pull framework come from the idea, the very powerful idea that people do not typically move from places because they expect to find a better environment or less population pressure. The general motivation for people to move is that they expect to be able to make a more satisfied life or make a more satisfying living elsewhere. So, migrants in fact move from areas with low population densities and relatively little environmental degradation to environmentally degraded places with high population densities, right? So, people generally tend to migrate to already crowded places, cities, towns, prosperous agricultural areas. These are all already crowded places, right? And despite being crowded, despite being highly dense in population, despite being environmentally polluted, they offer a better space in terms of whether it's social and economic opportunities, individual freedom, safety, education, healthcare, labor market activities, entrepreneurship, and also amusement, right? Also entertainment. So, this then again, Dehas argues, illustrates the limitations and even the potential triviality of the push-pull framework or of push-pull explanation. One of the other critiques of the push-pull model is that the model is economistic to a sense, rooted in a cost-benefit analysis. And as it is usually interpreted, it does not take into account how migrants perceive their worlds and relate to their kins, friends, community members, and so on. So, summing up, in this lecture, we looked first at Ravenstein's laws of migration, and we also looked at the critiques, but fundamentally, I will repeat, Ravenstein's work is seminal. The starting point of this work is, it's theorized from data, it's theorized from the census data of Great Britain, and it's the starting point for work in migration theory. His conceptualization of the currents of migration is truly extraordinary, and Ravenstein argued that migration is a fundamental, inseparable part of development. And likely, his framework is also economistic, and he says that the causes of migration are mainly economic. We then moved to Everett Lee's seminal work, which was a good starting point to engage with migration and in particular determinants. And we saw how Lee revised Ravenstein's 19th century laws, and he proposed a new analytical framework for migration. And it's early theoretical frameworks like Lee's that have contributed to a body of literature that is now referred to as push and pull factors of migration. We can say that Ravenstein work was focused more on the pull of the cities, whereas Lee's framework leaned both towards push and pull perspectives, the pluses and minuses of migration. Now, some of the major critiques of this work, of both the works, have been that they lack empirical validity for all the laws and theories. Having said that, these two major works continue to provide a foundation for migration studies and are the bedrock on which current theoretical and conceptual work on migration stands. And in the next lecture, we will move on to neoclassical theories of migration. And here is the list of references that were used for this lecture. I will stop now. Thank you very much.